Legends of Greek Mythology, the story of Theseus. Part 1. How Theseus came to Athens. Theseus and his mother Ethra lived at the foot of a great lonesome mountain at a place called Troezen. One day, long before the earliest time that Theseus could remember, Aegeus, the father of Theseus, took Ethra out among the singing pines on the mountainside. There he lifted a huge rock and buried underneath it his sword and sandals. Then, rolling the rock back into its place, he told Ethra that when Theseus was strong enough to lift this rock, she might let him take the sword and sandals and go to his father at Athens. This was the last that Ethra had ever seen of Aegeus, but she knew that he was the king of Attica and sat on the throne in the beautiful city of Athens. At last the time came when Theseus had reached a man's full strength and could lift the great rock. Then, taking the sword and the sandals from under it, he fastened the sword at his side, put the sandals on his feet, and was soon ready to set out for Athens. At that time the country between Troezen and Athens was wild and rocky, and behind many of the rocks lurked giants and robbers, ready to spring out upon lonely travelers. But by sea the way was much safer. Ethra's father, who was getting old and feeble, thought that Theseus had better go by sea. But Theseus said, "No, have I not my father's good sword? I will go by land, and if I meet with any adventures, so much the better." So Theseus bade goodbye to his mother and his grandfather and began his journey by land. He had not gone far among the wild rocks and crags near to Troezen before he was attacked by the robber Periphetes, who was called the club-bearer. This robber came running toward Theseus, swinging a great iron club. He looked very terrible indeed, but Theseus, with his father's sword in his hand, went bravely forward, and soon left the club-bearer lying dead in the road. The way to Athens was now so much the safer. Theseus took the great iron club of Periphetes and went on. Next he met with the pine-bender, a giant named Sinis, who used to catch all the travelers passing his way and tear them to pieces. The pine-bender did this by bending down the tops of 2 pine trees and then letting them spring back again after having tied his captives between them. Sinis carried a young pine tree for a club. Enormous as this club was, it was not so strong as the iron one which Theseus now carried. So when Sinis tried to tie Theseus to the tops of 2 pines, he found that he had met his match, for the iron club of Theseus came crashing down on the pine tree club of Sinis and splintered it into shreds. Then a blow or 2 more stretched the giant out under his pines. Before Theseus had gone very much farther on the road to Athens, he came to a village where all the people were living in terror of a fierce wild boar. He found this animal and killed it. Then he went on till he came to the shore of a gulf, where the robber Sciron lived. Sciron had a strange way of showing hospitality to travelers. After inviting them to remain overnight at his house, he used to seat himself on the edge of a high cliff and set his guests to washing his feet. While they were engaged in this work, he would kick them off the cliff into the sea. But he never did this again after Theseus traveled that road, for Theseus threw Sciron himself over the same cliff. Not far away lived another robber, Procrustes, who used to pretend to entertain strangers at his hut. Then, if they were too long for his bedstead, he would cut off their heads or their feet. If they were too short for it, he would stretch them to fit it. Procrustes, too, was slain by Theseus. Afterward, other robbers and giants met the same fate. By the time that Theseus reached Athens, he was well known in that city, for the people all along the way had been eager to spread the news of what he had done. In fact, only one man in all Athens knew nothing of his coming, and that man was his own father, Aegeus, the king. At this time, Medea, a beautiful woman and famous sorceress, was living in the king's palace. As she had a son whom she wished to place on the throne after King Aegeus was gone, perhaps it was natural that she should be sorry to have Theseus come to Athens. But this perfectly natural feeling of Medea's led to a very wicked act. By means of her knowledge of poisonous herbs, she mixed a very powerful cup, which would cause instant death to anyone who drank of it. Then, telling King Aegeus that the young stranger was a traitor and had plotted against his life, she contrived to make him hand this cup to Theseus when he presented himself at the throne. With no thought that it could contain poison, Theseus innocently raised the fatal cup to his lips, intending to drink to the king. Just then, Aegeus noticed the sword Theseus carried, and he knew by the carving on its ivory hilt that the so-called traitor was his own son. Instantly he struck the cup from the hand of Theseus and welcomed the young man as a father should welcome his son. When Medea saw that her wicked scheme had miscarried and that Theseus was recognized by his father, she was frightened. She did not dare to plan any further mischief to Theseus, but used all her enchantments to get herself safely away. First, she compelled a thick mist to rise from the river. Then, in the sudden darkness and confusion caused by the mist, she called her winged dragons, jumped into her chariot, and was soon far away from Athens, where she never dared to return. The people lost no time in telling the king all the brave deeds that Theseus had performed on his way from Troezen. The king was so well pleased with what he heard and so glad to have his son come to Athens that he appointed 3 days of public rejoicing and feasting. In the midst of all this merrymaking, a messenger came to tell King Aegeus that the collectors of the tribute had arrived from Crete. A long time before, the oldest son of King Minos of Crete had been slain in Athens. To avenge the death of the prince, King Minos brought a great army against Athens and compelled the Athenians to pay him a tribute every 9th year of 7 young men and 7 maidens chosen from among the noble families of Athens. It was whispered that the children of the tribute, as these young men and maidens were called, were destined to be devoured by the Minotaur, a bloodthirsty and savage creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, which King Minos kept in a labyrinth near his palace. No one who entered the labyrinth had ever been known to come out again. The cruel tribute had been paid twice already, and now the Athenians must pay for it the 3rd time. Theseus at once resolved to kill the monstrous Minotaur and so make an end of the tribute. Although King Aegeus tried to persuade him not to do so, he offered himself before the lots were drawn as one of the 7 young men. This pleased the Athenians and made Theseus very popular. On the day appointed, the 6 other men and the 7 maidens were drawn by lot, and everything was made ready for sailing. When starting out on such a sad voyage, it seemed fitting that the ship which carried the children of the tribute should be rigged with black sails. This had been done on the 2 former occasions when the tribute had been paid. Now that there was some hope of a happy outcome of the voyage, King Aegeus gave Theseus a white sail, which he told him to hoist instead of the black one, if he should succeed in killing the Minotaur and should start out on the homeward voyage safe and well. The aged king then bade his son goodbye and said to him, "From the top of yonder rock I shall watch every day for your return." Then the black-sailed ship passed slowly out of the harbor. The young people that it carried were very sad, for they never expected to see the sunny shores of Greece again. At least none of them but Theseus. He was as cheerful and as full of courage as when he set out for Athens with his father's sword hanging at his side. End of Part 1.